Today in the EU, unpacking the EU's crackdown on big tech. The European Commission is ramping up its oversight of major tech firms. Google's parent company Alphabet, Meta, TikTok, and Apple are all in the target of the Commission, but experts say that fines might not be enough to halt bad behavior. As the mandate of many European regulators comes to an end, they race against time to leave a lasting mark. Will they succeed in making digital spaces safer before the European elections? Hello and welcome. I'm Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. We're here with tech reporter Julia Tauer to discuss what is driving this crackdown on big tech. Julia, it's been a while since we talked about the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act. What's sparking this conversation again?
Basically, what I looked into in an article this week was why we see so many measures by the Commission suddenly in like a relatively, I think, short period of time on these acts, both of them, and also on competition law. I was wondering if there is something more behind it than simply they just being enforced.
Before we get into the investigations, could you briefly tell us what is the Digital Service Act?
Of course. So the Digital Services Act, or DSA for short, it entered into force on the 17th of February, and it's a horizontal legislation which aims to clarify the assignment of responsibility for actors operating online. This includes how to deal with illegal content, also like dangerous goods and harmful but legal content like hate speech. So for the DSA, online platforms with more than 45 million users monthly in the European Union entail a so-called systemic risk for society, and they must follow a specific regime, including transparency and risk management obligations.
What about the Digital Market Act instead?
The DMA, which is the Digital Markets Act, it's a landmark EU legislation that addresses digital companies that have attained a dominant position in crucial segments of the internet economy, and they act as a gatekeeper between business users and consumers. And the DMA aims to ensure fair competition in key internet sectors.
And so, who is the DSA after?
You think about all these big tech that have a really dominant position, social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok, or search engines like Google Search and Bing, but also retailers like AliExpress or Zalando, for example. I think this regulation really aims to ensure that smaller companies also have a chance and can actually be competitors.
What actors is the Digital Market Act targeting?
For the DMA, the designated gatekeepers are Google's parent company Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, which is TikTok's parent company, and Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, and also Microsoft.
So who are the big tech giants the European Commission is investigating into right now, according to the intel that you got? Is it all of the ones that you've mentioned on the list? Is it a few?
So there were a lot, I think, starting this year, but also especially the last few weeks. To name a few, the Commission is in legal battles with Meta and TikTok over the DSA fees. Also under the DSA, the Commission launched a probe into TikTok, including possible breaches in child protection. The Commission also launched investigations into Alphabet, Apple, Meta for anti-competitive behavior, and also AliExpress. So there's a lot, I think even more, but I think those are good examples to show that there's just a lot coming from the Commission.
And in terms of political motivation, in your article, you're mentioning a few European regulators. Let's talk about them and what are the motivations behind their investigations at the moment?
Yeah, so when I talked to experts for the article I mentioned, one of them mentioned a possible political pressure from Commissioner Thierry Breton. So from the possible political angle, I was told that he's a strong, he has a very strong advocacy for the DSA, and that's really evident when it comes to his interactions with CEOs and in public statements. And this can influence enforcement efforts at lower levels. And he was also granted enforcement powers for the DSA. So he's definitely one of the key players. And of course, there's also Margaret Vestager, who's the Commission's executive vice president.
We have analyzed the gatekeepers' compliance reports that we received on the 7th of March. Stakeholders provided feedback on the compliance solutions offered. Their feedback tells us that certain compliance measures fail to achieve the objectives. And
she's also understood to be working hard to pass the measures in the last months of her term, especially because she returned to the Commission in December after withdrawing her candidacy for the presidency of the European Investment Bank. So, some people also say that she's really trying to make this time count.
You were just saying a lot of announcements by the European Commission this month. What has been the most important of this announcement? What is the most important investigation?
Yeah, I guess that's a really good question. At the beginning of March, the Commission announced 1.8 billion euros fine for Apple, saying that the tech giant abused its dominant position for music streaming providers.
Earlier this month, Spotify sent a public letter to the European Commission complaining about Apple's use of unfair practices. Not much later, Thierry Breton replied.
If our investigation concludes that there is a lack of full compliance with the DMA, gatekeeper, of course, as you know, will face heavy fines.
And the fines have been issued, but it's hard to tell whether sanctions are an efficient tool against big tech corporations. They might see them as a fair cost to pay to be competitive on the market.
I think it's worth mentioning because this is the third biggest fine imposed against the company for breaching EU rules. So the first two places go to Google or Alphabet, which was hit with, I think, a 4.34 billion euros fine by the EU in 2018 and a 2.42 billion fine in 2017. So I think because of how large it is, that was interesting to see.
So both the DSA and the DMA were approved back in 2022. Why is this crackdown suddenly happening now?
So I mentioned both for the DSA and the DMA compliance deadlines, 17th of February and 6th of March, which means that back then, basically not all the big tech or the tech companies listed in the lists of these acts. So they were not forced to comply by then, and now they really had to.
Some experts say that the European Commission is rushing to implement something that was approved kind of a long time ago.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Some experts say that this is indeed in a rush, but I think it's sort of normal to revisit these acts, especially in cases of tech. There's a lot of talk about how to make digital laws future-proof and things like that. So I think it makes sense to revisit them, especially when there's a compliance deadline as well.
Speaking about elections, well, of course, we're full on heading into campaign season. You reported on the Digital Service Act and how the two things are related.
As I mentioned, there are social media sites on the DSA's list, and that means that they have to abide its rules. And I think it's no secret, that social media can influence political elections. So, for example, think about the content we see, like deepfakes, which are continuously on the rise. I mean, we have to see how it plays out for this year's European Parliament elections because not everything is clear. For example, TikTok and Meta issued its election guidelines, and the Commission also issued its own at the end of March under the DSA. They recommended mitigation measures and best practices to be implemented, but some of these are overlap with the platform guidelines. Experts also pointed out that, first of all, the Commission issued these 2 months before the elections, and that might be a little bit late.
Right.
And second of all, defining what, for example, political content or misinformation means is very important because it might not mean exactly the same thing for everyone. An example I was given, I remember, if it's political content already that a party advocates, let's say, for more bicycle lanes, or is it content about the Ukrainian war?
So there's confusion regarding what even constitutes political content. How is the European Commission addressing that?
The Commission tried to maybe clear up the guidelines, but I think some questions still remain. And it's not necessarily only about EU Parliament elections. What I think is interesting that the Washington Post, for example, posted a photo on Instagram. They tried to explain to users how to turn off Instagram's limitations of political content so they can see the paper's contents, which is also, again, something that is that political content or not, Because I think these definitions, when at first glance you think, oh, it's so straightforward, but maybe not so much when you actually need to implement the law on this. And the reason why I said that not everything is clear is also because I was told by experts that while before 2020 there was more clarity due to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, about 2 years ago, social media sites started to close up when it comes to data access. Experts are more aware of potential dangers. At the same time, researchers now have more difficult time to predict what might happen in case of the elections because of this lack of access to data when it comes to social media sites.
That's really interesting. What is the lack of data due to?
So what I was told is, for example, I think Twitter or now X was an example of the researcher that I talked to. And she mentioned that because some employees were let go of, and they are mostly from these topics, like, for example, safety, people working safety. And I think that might be one of the reasons why there's just not enough employees to do this. And I think also Twitter's, they also really restructure this, I think, how research can access their data. For example, I know you have to pay for that now.
From the elements that you've given us today, it is clear that the Commission is tackling a really complex issue. How is the institution planning to get it done before the end of the term?
I guess it's a question for them more than for me. But I think it's, as you mentioned, it's a sign of all these measures are, I think, a sign of they really try to get as much things done as possible. So I think that's all I can add to this.
It's about intention.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julia. I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractivist to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Nicoletta Ionta and me. See you tomorrow! As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.